So, Ambassador Lewis, it's great to have you with us. Thank you for coming along to the One Boat and to share something of your background in addressing human trafficking, because you were the first appointment for President Obama on addressing human trafficking and modern slavery with I think with a sort of worldwide portfolio, right?
That's right. And I think it's one of the reasons why I'm so happy to be able to join you in the boat. One of the things that I learned in coordinating the global fight against slavery and trafficking, at least, for the United States, was that this is something that is facing us everywhere. And our colleagues and our counterparts around the world are often dealing with, while with local variations, dealing with something that is very much a global phenomenon. And at the end of the day, we're really talking about people.
Yeah, we're talking about people, and we're talking about the abuse of people, and we're talking about our interruption of it, and what sort of world we can build where this doesn't happen as just a matter of course, business as usual.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that a lot of folks, when they think about human trafficking, they think about it from a very clinical or a very theoretical perspective. And so you end up having this kind of notion of flows of migration and push and pull factors and, millions of this and millions of that. And at the end of the day, we have to, I think, pull back and think about, the decision that somebody makes to go take a job somewhere else to try to make a better life for their family. The decision that a person makes, maybe who doesn't travel at all, but they're from an excluded community, they're making rational decisions that are right in front of them. And they're usually making them for the exact same reason that all of us make, food for our family, a better life for the next generation, and some kind of self-actualization. And so one of the things that I've become convinced with, and this is going to sound very weird, I think, but I know that you have thought of this as well. In some ways, we're in an arms race against the traffickers over the issue of hope. Can government, can society actually meet the needs of the vulnerable and job seekers and others better than the traffickers who hold out this false hope of a better life? We're really kind of tussling over that. And to the degree that slavery exists, I think it's a systems failure in that government and the economy as we have set up right now, the global economy, isn't being responsive to those people's needs. But so it's not about theories, it's about people.
That's for sure. But just as you're saying that, for everybody who is trafficked, there is somebody who is actually seeking in that process of being captured into that nexus, somebody looking for hope, looking for change, looking for opportunity. At the same time, we've got people who are making terrible, malign choices in terms of the ethics of respecting their fellow man, sister, brother in being part of the enslaving cycle. Have you any thoughts about that? Because for me, that's an area in which I think faith communities really have something very powerful to say if we could just start really coalescing on that and understanding what it takes to move into that malign set of those who are part of the trafficking, enslaving nexus.
As somebody who was in law enforcement for quite a bit of time as a prosecutor, I have certainly brought accountability in these cases as far as the carceral response. So, prison terms and things like that. And one of the things that I'm convinced about, even having been in that aspect of the fight, is that there is redeemability just as there is fallibility. And so I think that this is very much, the one aspect of the Christian tradition. Often we see, and I think especially in some of our more conservatively manifesting parts of Christianity, we see the accountability or the punishment part of that discussion more than we necessarily see the redemption part of that discussion. And yet, one of the most sacred um, pieces of religious music over the last 200 years, is it's a slavery redemption story, as far as Amazing Grace, and the fact that that is something that was sung at the recent inaugural in the United States. I think it says an awful lot, and that song means different things to different people. But at the end of the day, I think that there is that notion of, if a slave ship captain, can have that moment. Now, I, as somebody who prosecuted people who were the equivalent of slave ship captains, would say that accountability is still necessary, and yet redemption and redeemability. If we ever lose track of that, and if we ever give up on that, then we just as well go home.
Yeah, I think that, and I think prior to the requirement for either prosecution or redeemability, actually is formation, for which the Catholic tradition has been extremely strong. I mean, the Jesuits who said, give me a child until they're 7, and I will show you the man. And I think also on that front, we've slightly lost it in terms of really looking at the critical importance of both the state education structures, but also the preformative structures which are within the domestic environment, and to look at that whole space as to how those are all situated and protected and encouraged and created as safe spaces and well-resourced spaces by the state. What do you have to say about that? Because we know that this, there's intersectionality about
Exactly.
not only being at risk of being trafficked, but actually the risk of being somebody caught up in the trafficking nexus.
Well, it's interesting because I think I must have said it in speech, because I see it online about myself every once in a while. But I just
Beating yourself in public
exactly,
every day.
exactly. And if not, I'll say it today, and then everybody can quote that. I am very much a Vatican II baby, and when you think about kind of in the Catholic Church, kind of the impact of opening up not only the liturgy and the ability of the congregation to truly partake in the wonders of the liturgy, but also bringing in self-governance, so that you have communities reflected in a church that purports to be about community in the first place, as opposed to the individual relationship with Christ, as some of our Calvinist cousins focus on. But at the same time, you also have, I think, in the Vatican II and post-Vatican II Catholic Church, very much this notion of, kind of the ability of the child to understand and participate in their own moral formation. And so I think about, the catechism and the continuing education and everything else that we went through. And it was very much, we're going to tell you not only what the rule is, but we're going to tell you why the rule is. And we're going to talk about why that might be the case. And so that idea of being able to kind of help form one's own moral basis. It's no longer enough to say, well, here's this paragraph in Gaudium et Spes that says, you can't have, slavery, abuse of migrants, et cetera. The other thing that's listed in that paragraph, of course, is abortion. And you would think that that was the only word in that paragraph. But the other social ills that were focused on, I think that between slavery, trafficking, and abuse of migrants, that's three different ways of saying the same thing. And I certainly, in looking at those guiding principles, rather than it simply being, oh, well, there's that paragraph and I'm going to, end up looking at it and just accepting it and having everything around it. It's then what am I going to do with that? And what am I going to do with everything that I was taught as I was kind of forming my own personal morality? This is what's so interesting, I think, right now with, Joe Biden as president. You've got, a president that's made no bones about the fact that he's going to relook at the federal death penalty, who talks in the language of community, who talks in the language of Catholic social justice. It's not somebody who postures by going to church. It's not somebody who, I've been in church when he's come in a few years ago, and he unobtrusively comes into the back of the church and doesn't, trot up to the front and take a pew so he can be seen or anything like that. And when he's there, he is a member of the congregation. He's Joe. I think that says an awful lot about kind of what at least some of us in public life in the United States, kind of how we end up living our Catholicism, and hopefully how we end up taking that impetus out in the world and doing some good for the least of these.
The background for, I mean, how did you come to faith in the first place? You were born into a Catholic family. Was Granny terribly important, or was it Mum and Dad? I mean, how did that all work? And when did this sort of call into pursuing a life in the justice environment come to you? How did that all work?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, obviously, if you're Hispanic in the United States, or kind of anywhere in Latin America, the church, when you were my age, and I won't tell you how old I am, but when you're my age, you dimly remember, your grandmother and great aunts and everybody else, wearing mantillas and the lace and dressing somberly to go to church. But then you also end up experiencing the kind of unbridled joy of the 70s. Not just the Jesus movement in the United States, which I think a lot of people don't talk about anymore because it kind of got subsumed into kind of mega church Pentecostalism. But it was very big in the Catholic Church as well, and people forget that it came out of Haight-Ashbury in '68. It was the Jesus movement in the U.S. was very much not a response to or an oppositional response to the hippies. It actually was the hippies, and they were, a chunk of folks who were there during the Summer of Love were basically saying, we want this, what we're feeling. This is why you see, the musicals Godspell and Jesus Christ Superstar and everything else. Basically, people saying the joy and the community that we're feeling as far as what 1968. Not the bad parts, like Czechoslovakia and everything else, but the joy of that moment.
Yeah, all you need is love.
Right, and so I think that really now, Benedict, especially because of the protests and Czechoslovakia and Mexico and everything else, Benedict and a number of other traditionalists suddenly have a what have we wrought kind of moment around Vatican II that none of us in the 70s knew. We were too busy making burlap peace signs to hang up in our churches and having guitar mass. And so I was a little kid kind of squirming around enjoying the guitar music and helping cut out doves.
When did it come to you that actually your life might have a vocation into law enforcement? How did that work? Because I think for lots of people, they'd think, oh, well, if you were that way inclined, why didn't you go into the priesthood? We won't explore that, but something quick to say.
Well, it's interesting because the church that I grew up in and that I, especially in this COVID moment, now have been kind of reacquainting myself with, and that I'm joining my mother to attend on Sundays over the internet, was the Catholic Student Center at Iowa State University. There's, especially in the immediate wake of World War II, the Newman Centers, named for Cardinal Newman, basically become a fixture on most college campuses. And they, I think, were very much, seen as, kind of a way to continue, kind of early adult place in the church. But also they, became, and I think that for my parents in the 60s, they became, very much a focus of a diaspora community of Catholics, that each of whom had shown up, in those college towns on their own for a faculty appointment, didn't know anybody. It wasn't just, Hispanics or white ethnics, from the Ukrainian or Polish or Italian communities, but, kind of, in a lot of places, that was the only cluster of Catholics, especially in places like Iowa, where almost everybody was Lutheran or Methodist.
All right.
And so that idea that, kind of the church that I was in not only was, taking Vatican II very seriously with an early parish council and self-governments, involving, men and women. So both of my parents were on parish council in the 60s. But the, idea then of kind of being part of the university community. There's an endowed chair in the religion department for the founding priest of that parish, or in his name. And he was still alive when it was set up, and he was very adamant that the requirements make it very clear that that person need not be Christian. And I think that says an awful lot about what that parish was like. He was one of those old Irish American priests who had served in the army during the war, and taught all of us young men in the church that if you needed to put on the boxing gloves and go work it out, then that was a totally appropriate way to be on your journey. Exactly. So he was that kind of priest, but because I think of his service in the war, he also was a militant pacifist. And when I say militant pacifist, I'm like, he was a very proud Army veteran who was not afraid to put on the boxing gloves for peace. And so in the 70s, I think with the anti-nuclear movement, with the kind of what was happening on campus and being part of the campus community, but then especially I think for a lot of people in the United States, the situation in Central America ended up having much more of a Catholic field than I think a lot of political scientists necessarily think about now.
So all the work of the liberation
exactly
movements and local community realization of what it means to be Catholic.
Exactly. And I think that, one of the things that a lot of folks, as they look at what they see as the kind of post John Paul conservative swing in the American Catholic Church, or at least in parts of the American Catholic Church, they kind of miss the fact that so much of what was going on in Central America, so much of the liberation theology that was happening, was being supported by American parishes, and not supported in some kind of international conspiracy kind of way. It's literally parish to parish, sending down blankets, sending down cans, but also American nuns going down and putting themselves in harm's way and being murdered for it. And I think that for me and for a lot of us who were active in the sanctuary movement in the early 80s, where people were literally hiding illegal aliens in church basements in order, as they fled the war, especially in El Salvador, after, I think that the war in El Salvador manifested itself much more directly against the church than what was going on in Guatemala and Honduras, as far as clergy and even, Archbishop Romero being assassinated. But, we were seeing that with sister parishes all over the region. The Washington Organization in Latin America, WOLA, was a very kind of Catholic-driven movement, but it also had a lot of roots in Iowa, with a lot of Iowans being involved with its formation, and Tom Harkin, our senator, who is also from this Catholic tradition, then being active in it. And so I think that for me, being in that parish, with the combination of the lay ministers who were doing work in Central and South America, who were doing work within the sanctuary movement, as well as the peace movement and the anti-nuclear movement, you end up having, kind of a understanding that engagement is appropriate. The contemplative life, or even a vocation, end up being less interesting than, my political science professor who taught the Latin American stuff was also active in our church on these exact issues. And so, when you end up having, a lot of those threads
Connections.
just all came together. The idea that
Absolutely.
if one was interested in foreign policy, you're learning in the classroom from somebody who happens to be one of your parents' friends from church, who's talking about, what the United States has done in Latin America over the years from a very progressive standpoint that then comes back to this.
It gives another standpoint, doesn't it? This is the point about a faith discourse, is that you have another community of which you are a part that is not the national state citizenship. There is another community, there is another drum that is sounding somewhere. You're looking at life.
I always laugh because, now that I've been, logging on to church with my mom on the weekends, at the announcements at the end of Mass, I think probably 2 weeks out of every month, there's an announcement about, that a new shipment of coffee has come in and it's available in the socially distant, available in the parking lot as you leave, from our sister parish in Honduras. And, that, the idea that we would not just have that relationship and send money down, to support, their work, which is kind of the traditional way that, global North churches support global South churches. But, that it's basically, we've set up a coffee house, at the student center, and we sell their goods because it's much better to support, we're in Iowa, and Iowa State is a agricultural college as well as a liberal arts college. And so the notion that we'd be supporting the farmers in our sister parish, not simply, the priests and the nuns in our sister parish.
It's been absolutely fascinating, Lewis. Thank you so much for taking us through this walk. I'm wondering whether you might just bring us right up to the present in terms of what you're doing at Yale, and what you think the top 3 areas to be addressed now as we're looking at, hopefully, escaping from the COVID morass over the next, few months and into 2022. What do you think on the modern slavery, human trafficking agenda we need to be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of it is, that I'll tie off that last thread in that, I think that one of the most important things that we have to do, the COVID moment and the rise of technologies that allow us to actually have to confront the inequities in whether it's in policing or it's in criminal justice, law enforcement, et cetera, especially around the death of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis police officers this last year. I think perhaps, at least in the United States, it's giving us a moment where we can now, maybe what I've been trying to say can be heard a little bit more, that those issues are not divisible. The issue of police misconduct, racial violence, and slavery are all part of a certain racial and cultural and social structure. And we've been, I think, in the anti-trafficking and anti-slavery community, for a whole host of reasons, we've not always been interrogating the racial and economic underpinnings that end up manifesting through these things. And so I think that for me, one of the most important things, and certainly, as a senior fellow at the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale, and as a lecturer in the law school and the architecture school, I've been trying to confront these things, but I've been trying to confront them very much in that kind of a cross disciplinary, much more multi-sectoral manner. And, I think I've always tried to do that, but it didn't always necessarily translate, or it wasn't being heard
Yeah.
in the same way. I think that the other thing is, again, thinking of, the multifaceted nature of this, I do think that we have to continuously recommit to this 3P paradigm of prevention, protection, and prosecution. I think that the way that you recommit to that is you add the catalyst of partnerships and maybe call it a 4P paradigm. But, I think looking at those things and then what everyone can do within it. In the faith community, we certainly, see this as, a combination of the prevention, especially with the legislative. There's never been, I think, a successful anti-slavery legislation has not been passed, since the late 1700s without the church being involved. If you don't think about this as a moral issue, if you don't think about this as a spiritual issue, then it simply devolves over to, what's best for business or what's best for the status quo or what have you. And religion necessarily challenges the status quo. I think there's some money changers outside of the temple that found that out. But, I think that this is, one of the things that we see is it's not simply, let's bring in the church and we'll have some, task force and say everybody should do something about trafficking. And then the other P's of protection and prosecution then should be for the state. That idea of, where do victims seek help? A lot of them seek help in the church because, it's a place where they feel safe. It could be that it's a place where the activism of the church finds the people. Without the nuns who are going on their canoes up the rivers in eastern Peru to the gold mining things, most of those young women never get help. If the nuns stopped going upriver, the women would still be trapped up there, sadly. So that idea of the faith community as a identifier as well as a service provider. In a lot of Latin America, unfortunately, the church is the only service provider, and the state does need to step up.
It is the social services, as which is, I was called, God's social service when I started up these safe housing by the faith communities here in Britain. And I just thought, well, actually, that's probably right, except we've got state social services as well.
Well, and the state, and I do think that one of the things that we see is that that the faith community needs to hold the state accountable.
Exactly.
There's a strong, especially with our with our Pentecostal and with some of our millenarian kind of Great Awakening American sects, a strong desire to kind of retreat from worldliness and to basically say we're just going to do our thing and the state should do its thing. And I think that's
how to manage
that doesn't really work. It's you have to. I, of course, everything I've said today I think shows that I came from a place that says the church has to be in the world.
Yeah.
But that idea that the state needs to not simply outsource all of those protective functions to the church, but the church also needs to not
outsource
doing it. So,
outsource life to the state.
Exactly. The final thing is, we've seen, whether it's through Clinic, which is Catholic Legal Immigration Services, whether it's through others, one of the secret weapons for the cases that I did in the prosecutions, whether criminal prosecutions or civil actions being brought on the part of victims, have been, whether it's people in vocation who are also lawyers or paralegals working in the migrant community, or whether it's, former, like, Terry Coonan at Florida State, former priest who does amazing work on this. I keep telling him that he still is in his vocation. He just gave up his collar. Or, people like Sister Maureen Donahoe and others who are, out there, historically we're out there going out into the fields and, talking to the workers.
Yeah.
So to me, that notion of, looking at the 3P paradigm, which is, you know, kind of how we organize this over the last
Yeah.
20 years in the international realm.
Space. Yeah.
You know, that the 3P paradigm fits in quite well with another Trinitarian approach that's out there. And, you know, I feel like you can't do this work without, I think you can do this work without your own, you know, I think that people who don't have a faith tradition, people who are atheists, people who express their values through other ways, you know, have very much have a place in this. And some of them, people that come from that background or have chosen that background are, you know, amazing parts of
Amazing
this movement.
advocates for change, amazing advocates. It's about incorporating all citizens, isn't it? I've just thought of a fifth P though, which is prayer. Not something that the UN is likely to elaborate as the fifth P, but I think, you know, inside the faith community, we really do need to be thinking about actually how we preach justice and social participation, and how we also elaborate that in our own prayer lives to really center ourselves, you know, on the importance and the significance of social justice, equality, a safe space to call our global home, right?
Exactly. And I think that I'm so glad that you chose prayer, because the other one, which, you know, I think that, you know, proselytizing is one of the,
Did I? You went to proselytizing.
no, and I'm actually, this is me not going to proselytize, you know. Well, the first three letters of that word can then be hijacked and turned into professionalization. And I think that's one of the things that, you know, whether somebody's church affiliated or not, I think that, you know, we have to think of ourselves, whether we're service providers, whether we're academics, whether we're in law enforcement or government, you know, coming at this from the professional standpoint, where we put the needs of the, exactly. You know, because if we see this simply as rice bowl Christianity or an opportunity to you know change a few souls, then shame on all of us.
Yeah. So your prayer.
For me, the prayer truly is, and I, you know, being Catholic, we hire priests to do our praying for us. But the no, to me, and you know, it, for being a prayer that everybody knows and everybody says, you know, kind of constantly, it is a very you know, personal prayer, and that is, you know, the notion that we would center so much of, at least in my family and in my faith, you know, center our requests for intercession to not the Father God, but to the Mother God, or the Mother Goddess. And so the, you know, for me, it always comes down to the notion that Mary and the grace that she brings is with us, not only as we live, but also will be there when at the hour of our death. And so, you know, to me, it's less a matter of am I actually outwardly saying a prayer in front of other people? The answer is I'm kind of always saying a Hail Mary, and not simply a, you know, grant my wish, like, you know, some kind of magical goddess, but, you know, give me that grace to make the kind of sacrifice that she herself made. You know, the idea of her having to not only flee with her child from the state and be a refugee in Egypt, but the notion of having to see her son executed by the state, and to witness that and to still carry on. You know, to me, that is, there's not much that I have to go through that I can really whine about if I think about her. So I think that's the Hail Mary is very much, and is said constantly.
Ambassador Lewis C de Baca, thank you so much for sharing a little bit of your life and your insights on what's happening at present, and your hopes for the future with us today. Thank you so much.